Although I've been worn down by life to such an extent that my internal age feels equivalent to one of the dudes from Raiders after they looked inside the Ark of the Covenant, I actually only turned 30 last year. For you mathematically challenged individuals out there, that means I was born in 1993. As a consequence of this, the first game console I ever owned was a PS1, and even then, because I was so young, I mostly just played FIFA and a bunch of licensed games of varying quality. Disney's action game featuring Hercules was a personal favourite. What a truly inspired title. But I was never able to beat that game, and this speaks to my point. I started seriously playing games long after 3D graphics were a thing, and naturally gravitated towards 3D games because in my naive, childish brain, 2D games, particularly side-scrolling ones, just seemed inferior by comparison. Sure, I had various iterations of the Game Boy and remember playing multiple Mario games, and I played the original Rayman on PS1, in addition to the aforementioned Disney's action game featuring Hercules. I still can't say that title without laughing. But I was never any good at those games, and I often found myself just replaying the beginning levels over and over again until the difficulty started ramping up, and I would eventually put the games down. Then as I get older and as 3D games became even more prevalent, all traces of anything side-scrollery just completely vanished from my gaming lexicon. This means that now, as an adult, I've built up zero muscle memory or basic skill when it comes to 2D games. I was basically one step up from the stereotypical person who plays a first-person shooter for the first time and can't control both analog sticks simultaneously, so sort of walks about everywhere like Robocop. The end result of this, that is on the rare occasion that a 2D game does tickle my fancy, I basically just can't play it and bounce off it more or less immediately. In particular, I remember trying to play the first Ori game because the art style looked cool, but I don't even think I made it an hour into that before I got filtered. Rogue Legacy was another one I got sucked into because people were talking about it, and I don't think I could beat the first boss. And then I remember trying to go back and play the original Mega Man a number of years ago and don't think I got past the first level. All of that is to stress that I'm a literal potato when it comes to 2D games, particularly anything that involves side-scrolling combat or platforming, just purely because of my lack of experience with games in that space. One of the things I did have a lot of experience with though in my younger days was Prince of Persia, specifically the PS2 era Prince of Persia games that begin with Sands of Time, because I know that Prince of Persia actually goes back to Jordan Mechner in the late 80s. I know it's not apples to apples and these are slightly different things, but for whatever reason when I was younger, games like God of War and Devil May Cry passed me by, and Prince of Persia was the series that I gravitated towards. So when I discovered a couple of months ago that Ubisoft were attempting to reboot the franchise with the now recently released Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, I was instantly excited and then immediately disheartened when I learned that unlike the games that I loved, this was a 2D side-scrolling metroidvania. So I initially cursed and put the game to the back of my mind, assuming it wasn't going to be for me. Then, shortly before release, preview coverage started to drop and word spread that the game was shaping up to be pretty cool. Added to that, from the footage that was available, the art style and the animations looked really compelling, so as a result, I was sucked back in. Eventually I thought, fuck it, I'm going to buy it, who knows, maybe this will be the one, and if nothing else it looks cool and I like to support developers that make cool shit. After putting about 22 hours into the game, I actually beat it. I managed to make it all the way through, and I have to say, I fucking loved it. It's fantastic. So what is Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and why did it grab me where other games have failed in the past? Well, as alluded to previously, The Lost Crown represents Ubisoft's attempt to bring Prince of Persia into the modern era. Rather than playing as the titular prince, you play as Sargon, a young warrior who's part of a group called the Immortals. You and your companions are tasked with travelling to Mount Kaf to rescue the prince, who's been kidnapped and taken there. However, when you arrive, all is not as it seems, and in typical Prince of Persia fashion, there is some weird time things happening.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey.
So as Sargon, you must navigate your way through the various treacherous areas of Mount Kaf and fight through a variety of monsters and human enemies, collecting powers and uncovering more of the mystery surrounding the city and the prince's kidnapping as you go. Overall, I'd say this story is fine. Sargon is a really cool character who starts the game as an arrogant and quick to anger youth, and then goes through what is a pretty reasonably compelling arc as the plot progresses. The other members of the Immortals pop up from time to time as you journey through the game, and they, combined with a few other interesting NPCs, add a little bit of flavour to what would otherwise be a fairly silent and lonely adventure. But I don't feel like you spend enough time with any of them to develop particularly strong feelings about them. It's a bit like the Avengers if every hero only got 2 minutes of screen time. Equally though, I can understand the decision to keep character interactions light. Most people will ultimately come to a game like this for the gameplay, so it could have overall been hampered by holding players back with more frequent and lengthy NPC dialogues. Everything else, narrative-wise, I would say is serviceable, but nothing to write home about. The plot does have a couple of interesting twists along the way, but it mostly just serves as a reason for you to go to the next area and fight the next boss. I mentioned previously that one of the things that drew me to the game initially was its art style. However, after beating the game, I'm left a little bit conflicted about this. I still think there are elements of the overall look of the game that are cool, in particular the design of Sargon, his comrades, and a lot of the enemies. I do still like a lot of the animations, particularly if you execute a parry or pop off a special move, and there are also parts of some of the environments that do look beautiful, but at times and in specific scenarios, particularly when the game switches to a 3D perspective for specific non-gameplay related reasons, I think it can look a bit generic. I think it adopts quite a similar cartoony, perhaps Fortnite-esque art style that a lot of games shoot for these days, and I always just find it really underwhelming. But that, as a lot of things, is of course a point of personal taste. By far and away, the thing that kept me going through the game was the gameplay. With this being a 2D metroidvania, you spend the game going from area to area, boss fight to boss fight, collecting new powers. You can then use these powers to backtrack to past areas, unlock previously inaccessible pathways for the potential of finding upgrade currency, collectibles, or things like amulets that give Sargon additional, mostly passive abilities. On top of this, as you progress further, you'll be expected to utilise your newly amassed powers in increasingly difficult platforming challenges and boss fights, until by the end of the game, it expects you to be able to deploy everything in your arsenal in concert. I would say I probably struggled a little with the combat initially. Your attacks generally either cause Sargon to move in a specific direction or propel the enemy that you're fighting in a certain direction. This means that when fighting normal enemies, where the geometry around you is dependent on your exact positioning rather than, say, in an open boss arena, you need to look ahead and be mindful of where your next attack will result in you and your enemy ending up. I found that quite often I would launch my enemies up to somewhere that I hadn't intended, like onto a platform, only to then whiff my next couple of attacks and have to go and frustratingly chase after them. This was definitely a skill issue on my part though, as the more I became accustomed to what all my attacks did, the more I was able to coherently string combos together and better control my fights. It's worth noting that the game does have an inbuilt sort of tutorial feature where one of your immortal companions sort of trains Sargon in his various abilities, and I found this quite helpful in helping me understand what all of his attacks did. It's the boss fights, however, that were by far my favourite aspect of the Lost Crown, and if I had to put my finger on one thing, I would suggest that's probably what made me stick with this game and made it click for me where others have came and went. In the early game, before you have much in the way of abilities, in boss fights you'll be heavily reliant on dodging attacks, using Sargon's slide, which gives him iframes, or parrying. This definitely awakened the part of my brain that fell in love with FromSoft's Soulsborne games, and this feeling only became more intense as the difficulty ramped up, and the game expected me to display a wider array of skills in order to avoid and counter boss attacks. It's worth highlighting that the game does get pretty difficult. Whilst it doesn't adopt the Soulsborne system of significant progress loss on death, the comparison to FromSoft's games in terms of boss difficulty is an apt one. In fact, like FromSoft's games, The Lost Crown achieves that wonderful feeling where you enter a boss arena and for the first few attempts it seems completely impossible. Its attacks feel unreadable and unavoidable, and you just don't see any way that you could possibly triumph. Then, slowly but surely, you start noticing tells and uncovering hard counters to most of what the boss can do, and if your experience is anything like mine, before long you'll find that the boss is hardly able to touch you. That should speak to how well the bosses and the game generally are designed. The one part of the gameplay I didn't really jive with was the exploration. As someone who considers Batman Arkham Asylum my favourite game and has platinumed it twice, I'm no stranger to backtracking and some Metroidvania-esque exploration. However, there are some specific ways in which The Lost Crown handles its exploration that made it feel frustrating to me. Another thing which The Lost Crown borrows from the Soulsborne series is the bonfire system, but in Lost Crown, rather than bonfires, it's whack whack trees. So basically, if you die anywhere in the game other than in a boss fight where the game lets you just instantly retry, you spawn back at the last whack whack tree that you rested at. You also need to rest at one of those trees to replenish your health potions. However, unlike how most of the Soulsborne games work, you can't simply fast travel between all the whack whack trees. Instead, there are a very limited number of trees that happen to have separate fast travel points located near them. Also, unlike Souls games, there's no option to warp back to the last tree that you rested at, or even to your central hub. You need to manually walk back to the nearest fast travel point once you're done exploring an area. This, combined with the fact that in my experience, a significant number of the things I would find while exploring were basically useless, either some currency I didn't need or a purely lore-centric collectible I wasn't interested in, meant that exploration felt like a bit of a chore to me, so I ended up just basically giving up on it about 2/3 of the way through the game. I think if there was some option to warp back to the last spot you rested at, or if more of the stuff you found actually translated into meaningful character progression, this would feel a million times better. The last thing I wanted to touch on is I did run into a few meaningful bugs during my playthrough. I played on PS5, and whilst generally performance was stellar, I did have one instance where I went invisible and fell through the world during a boss fight, and then there was another case where a different boss went invisible for a bit during the fight, and I'm also pretty sure one of the side quests in the game were bugged and I just couldn't do anything with it. None of this was particularly game breaking to me because I didn't really care about the side quests, but it does seem like the Lost Crown could have benefited from a little more time in the oven. Overall, I loved my time with Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. In particular, its challenging but extremely rewarding boss fights invigorated that part of my brain that fell in love with Dark Souls so many years ago. It's one of those rare games that made me actually get out of my seat and celebrate when I beat a boss. It's more than just overcoming the challenge, which is rewarding though. The act of piece by piece uncovering counters and responses to each attack is one of the most satisfying and fulfilling gaming experiences I've had in recent years. It has reopened my mind and hopefully taught me some of the skills that I'll need to play and enjoy many other games in this space going forward. As I said, it's a difficult game, so it inevitably won't be for everyone, but if that sort of challenge speaks to you, then I wholeheartedly recommend you give it a try. Finally, I hope that The Lost Crown's critical success serves as a message to Ubisoft to try more projects which experiment with existing formulas rather than churning out the same open world game 100 times. So, have you played Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown? What did you think of it? What are some other games in this space you'd suggest I try? Let me know in the comments below.